All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for coming. If it is your first time here, and if you're coming again, welcome to Trajectory Labs. And if you need to use the washrooms just outside the glass doors, you can use the keypad above the pin above the keypad to get back in. Yeah, we're going to start right away. I'm excited to introduce Wim Howson Creutzberg. Did I get that right? All right, amazing. It's right there. I guess I could have checked. Anyways, we're excited to have Wim here. He's going to be talking about entity-based AI governance. Yeah, big round of applause for Wim.
Thanks, Mario. Hi, my name is Wim. I am an independent AI policy researcher. I am going to talk to you today about a framework that I think is useful for thinking about what AI regulation looks like, right? How should we govern AI? The question on everyone's mind. I think there is an actual answer to this question, at least for frontier models. I think that the case that I'm going to be talking about here, provided my clicker starts working at some point, hopefully in the near future, is compelling. I find it compelling. Hopefully you will too. Hopefully we'll be able to talk about it. I think I'm kind of torn here. I think on the one hand, I find discussions after the talk can be stifled by like a question period that kind of concentrates the locus of attention on the talk giver. On the other hand, when we have lots of questions during the talk, sometimes there are people whom I very much appreciate, but who find themselves asking 1 to 2 dozen questions over the course of a 20-minute period. And if you suspect that you might be one of those people, you would care to refrain until the end of the talk, that would be great. It's working. Oh, spoilers. Okay, that's great. Behind the podium, yes. Yes, great. Yes, check yourself. But other than that, please, welcome questions during the talk. Clarification questions are great. Like substance-based questions are great. Questions of, let me explain my worldview to you in 5 minutes and then ask how this talk intersects with my worldview are more welcome after the talk. But that's enough of that. The main point of this talk is, yes, to talk about this proposal, this way of thinking about what AI regulation, AI governance looks like, what it can look like, and why I think it's compelling for regulating frontier models or frontier AI systems. I think there's also a kind of a general takeaway that I have, ironically, which is that it's better to think at the margin. It's better to think about what the best way of approaching a certain kind of AI regulation is right now for the foreseeable future, and not as opposed to having a kind of general theory of what the best approach is. Of course, there is an irony here because that is itself a general theory and I recognize that. But I think that this holds, or at least at the margin. I think we should be thinking a lot more at the margin about what kinds of approaches to AI regulation are viable. And last, I think there's a kind of fun segue here that serves half as an illustrative example of the kind of dynamic that I'm talking about, and also as a perhaps a useful update on some significant AI legislation that has come in the last roughly 24 hours. So we can talk about that. And without further ado, we can get into it. You'll note here we have a very fun graphic. Most of the slides don't have fun graphics. On the next one, oh no, it was removed. Okay, that's okay. So the slides, I think it might be a little bit difficult visually, and there aren't very many fun graphics, which is to say there are no fun graphics to kind of help you deal with that. I would recommend just listening to my voice if you find it mind-numbing to kind of read the slides and listen at the same time. But you get a fun graphic for this one. So the main article I'm going to be talking about, or the content of the talk is based on an article pictured here: entity-based regulation in frontier AI governance, rolls right off the tongue. And this article basically argues that for mitigating frontier AI risks from systems that aren't very well understood, that are at the cutting edge of current AI capabilities, the approach we should take is we should try and regulate AI companies, as opposed to, namely, trying to regulate AI models. So regulating GPT-5 as opposed to OpenAI. AI uses, right? So, okay, someone or some company uses AI badly, in a way that we as legal authorities don't endorse. We'll try and punish them for that. Or as opposed to kind of regulating AI inputs, right? So this is, compute governance is a classic example. We can even say data governance, right? These are approaches we could take to not AI governance in general. We're just talking about frontier AI governance. And this talk, based on this paper, is kind of saying we should centrally be focused on regulating the companies and not any of these other things. And so I'll talk about why they think that is. Hopefully distilling the most compelling points, and I've kind of eliminated here for your own sake the points that I find less compelling. And then I'll talk about why these approaches are not good and why these other approaches are maybe better. Yes, again, there are no graphics. This is maybe a somewhat subtle distinction, so bear with me. First, what are the challenges of model-based regulation, right? So this is the approach that people have thought a lot about, and I think it's also kind of a very common approach to thinking about AI risks, AI opportunities. We think the kind of unit of analysis is the AI model, right? And this has been the case for some time. I'll give an example here of a bill proposed and vetoed a day past 1 year ago in California that kind of took as its kind of unit of regulatory focus AI models, right? And the kind of problems that people have very loudly articulated with that approach. Okay, and so more completely, what are we talking about here? We're talking about, in this case, right, SB 1047 had it that here are all these regulations, and some AI model is subject to these regulations if it has these properties. If it, in its case, is kind of, if its training run has over 10 to the 26 flops, and has costs over, I think it's something like $100 million, something like that, right? So these are these properties in this case of the training run, right? But of the kind of the AI systems themselves, and this is what will determine whether or not something is within regulatory scope. What are the problems with this? There are a few. So I think fundamentally the problem is that the nature and kind of shape and character of AI progress has changed very quickly and changes very quickly and will continue to change very quickly. And these thresholds don't, right? So we say if you're above this flop threshold, these regulations apply. If you're above it, if you're below it, they don't apply. Since in the time, even as this bill was being debated, especially after the bill was being debated, after it was vetoed, people pointed out that there were these, there was these changes in the way that AI progress happened, right? We started focusing a lot more on reasoning models, or more on models that use a lot of compute during while they were running, as opposed to when they were being trained. Whereas this bill had only focused on the models while they were being trained, or the amount of compute they were using while they were being trained. There are we can imagine some approaches people are taking are to have some big model and then distill that model into a much smaller model, right? And then like how do we measure the kind of the amount of compute used to train this much smaller model, but that might be as capable as the big model, and it is kind of derived from it. These are questions that we've had to kind of wrestle with, that these thresholds wouldn't have dealt with well. And there are other similar emerging problems and problems on the horizon, right? If you have, if we get to a point where we have kind of continual learning in AI systems, okay, do we count the compute used, when the systems are updating meaningfully towards training compute? Do we count in a case where you have a system that is kind of a combination of, oh, if I'm not speaking to the mic, by the way, you want to like blink twice at me, that'd be very helpful. If there are cases where we're kind of combining a bunch of smaller models, and then we're kind of we have like some larger system, and we're kind of subdividing tasks and assigning them to different smaller models. How do we measure compute in this case? It's hard to do. It's possible to do, but it's hard to do. We can imagine it getting harder, right? And this is this general problem here of like the nature of AI is unpredictable. It's hard, and the thresholds are not equipped well for that. It's just not a great fit. And so this is kind of this problem of trying to anticipate the way that this will change. And there's also this problem, and we'll see this also with use case based development of pre-deployment risks, right? A lot of, I think, concerns that people have around model autonomy, among other things, come from what we expect the kind of phase during training, or while the models are being tested, and at least as it has existed so far, it has, I think, as it has been typically imagined, model-based regulation doesn't account for this, right? Because the model doesn't even properly exist yet, right? So that's hard. And then there's another kind of minor point about a certain kind of risk that we can imagine. Right? We can imagine something where there's a dangerous or very sensitive piece of information that is conveyed from one party to another. Maybe this happens because some model is jailbroken, or maybe it happens because the piece is a very compelling example if you like to go and see that. But the bottom line is that there are kinds of risks that come from certain kinds of information about the models themselves getting out, about AI progress in general, right? How to create certain kinds of models. There's that itself is a risk, and it doesn't come from the models themselves, right? So okay, this doesn't deal well with that. Maybe you're convinced, maybe you think that model regulation is now a terrible idea, and you'd be tempted to check out use-based regulation. You think this is the way to go. We'll regulate cases of people using models badly. Very alluring, right? We do this in lots of industries. We do this in lots of cases. Dean Ball and I think it's Ketan and Ramakrishnan argue that this is also not the approach that we should take. We should instead, wow, the mic really does make a difference. We should instead focus on, well, they argue that this has its own challenges, right? Such as, again, for those risks that manifest pre-deployment, we kind of don't have they're outside of the scope of this regulation, though it would like to try and mitigate them, right? Issues related to the models themselves doing things that are harmful kind of don't fall in this scope. Maybe they could at some point, but they don't by default, right? And so what do we do about that? And there's also this problem of yeah, again, so and I think this is kind of what I find most compelling is that there's this, there are lots and lots of use cases that could be dangerous that we couldn't anticipate before they happen. Like there are like things that people could do with the models as people have already done, right? I don't need to name all of the various nefarious and mischievous things people have done with AI systems. I'm sure you can imagine them or have read the news. And the problem then is that we just can't anticipate what those use cases are going to be, right? There might be some use cases that we never even would have thought of that we thought would have been fine, and that it turns out actually aren't fine. And how can we know that in advance? We probably can't. And there are probably also just like so many different kinds of use cases, right? Of course, maybe the expectation that this is the silver bullet is too high, right? Maybe we won't cover all use cases, but maybe use-based regulation could be useful in some cases. And indeed, it definitely would be. Again, the argument isn't that this isn't useful in general. It's that it's not useful for trying to mitigate for doing frontier AI governance, right? Trying to mitigate the risks that come from the cutting edge before things are kind of well established. We know what's going on. And one other kind of point that they make is that it can be too onerous. I think maybe the argument they use here is a bit, the example they use is a bit misleading, but they refer to an actual bill from Texas that was being debated into the kind of spring of this year, where if a company was going to, not a small business, but kind of a company was going to use AI systems in a way that would kind of meaningfully impact the behavior and decisions of that company, they would have to do things such as make an impact assessment for with respect to their use of AI. They would have to do this paperwork, and that could this was like there are lots of it kind of gets into this kind of muddy territory where you might use AI as it feeds into some much larger process, and even in that case, right, in all of those cases, you would have to do this algorithmic impact assessment, right? They say if a company, there's a strong case maybe that you could have made that companies that wanted to like use social media or use ChatGPT to write a job description would have had to every time would have had to kind of write these algorithmic assessments, and that seems ridiculous, right? Now, they say that it's kind of small businesses that would have had to do that. This bill excluded small businesses, but still, it seems hard, and it seems hard for another reason that I find interesting. They refer to some work by a researcher, Jeffrey Ding, who's written about how the adoption of new general purpose technologies, right, other than AI, in the past has and the kind of the success in adopting them and in kind of spurring economic activity has come from people being able to just like try stuff out, right? Has come from people being able to kind of use AI systems in creative ways and kind of and innovative ways, and that has been very helpful. Adoption is very important. You don't want to get that wrong. And this could make it very difficult for even within the firm, right? You can imagine if you have to do all these impact assessments, then maybe the ways that people are allowed to use AI get kind of decided at the top, or the kind of decision-making power about how people in the firm can use AI gets like centralized in some part of the firm, and then you like don't get this kind of these opportunities for kind of creative uses and this like genuinely useful adoption that comes from trial and error. You get it. This is a concern with this kind of regulation. Okay, now again, to be fair, does that have to do with frontier AI risk? There's maybe an open question there. We can talk about that. Also, if there are questions at any point, feel free to raise your hand. I will then talk about entity-based regulation and why this is kind of great in their view, or relatively kind of fitting for addressing these kinds of risks. I think fundamentally the case that they make is that if you're looking at a company, right, there are really only a very small number of frontier companies right now at the cutting edge, right, who are kind of concern to frontier AI regulators. And those companies and their structure changes much slower, changes much at a rate much closer to that of that regulators themselves operate at than AI companies than AI itself progresses at, right? AI moves very fast, but like it's hard to kind of restructure your company. Maybe it's hard to change the nature of your company, and there are far fewer of them. It's hard to do it as quickly as kind of AI progresses, right? And so it's just kind of an easier target, you can say. And there's precedent here. We can kind of look at things that are like AI, right? They kind of draw this distinction between, okay, on the one hand, you can imagine drug pharmaceuticals. We kind of have a process for discovering and doing trials for drugs. We see that there's a stage where there's a risk, and we know what that stage is, and indeed, drug regulation happens at the level of drug product lines themselves, and not at the regular level of companies. Whereas, in contrast, in finance, which is a place where the decisions that companies make can kind of continuously affect levels of risk for certain products and things that they're releasing, things that they're doing. Much like AI companies, right? Like we release this product, we release GPT-5, we can like adjust it and like re-release that, and that'll still have effects even after people have used some version of it, right? And those changes can happen very quickly, right? In these much more dynamic environments, indeed, we regulate the companies. Is the point that they make. It's easier to do it. It's just a better kind of object of focus. And there's maybe this abstract argument here we can imagine about how, assuming we're kind of coming at this from a kind of security and safety focused and motivated kind of point of view, or at least as concerns safety and security, those things are not a model property, right? It's not something that, not quite something that you could either have in a system or you don't, that you can kind of evaluate, right? That kind of gets at some kind of concerns about safety that we might have. but not all of it. And it's also not entirely driven by people using the models wrong, right? For each of those categories, we can kind of draw, they don't encompass all of the cases that we might be concerned about. And not only because the Venn diagram there isn't a circle, but also because the threat models that we can imagine are complex, right? They emerge from the interaction between lots of different systems happening. That's kind of not very concrete, but they don't come from any kind of given source. But they would kind of suggest that the entities that have the most fine-grained control and kind of awareness of what's going on with respect to this kind of process by which risks emerge, are the AI companies, right? Okay, how do we measure this, right? Here's a concern that you might have. A question, astute audience members may note that we can imagine similar problems with thresholds, right? We have this problem where, okay, we have these compute thresholds, but, and we didn't talk about this, but these thresholds are kind of vague. They're a little bit arbitrary. They kind of change often. Do we not have similar threshold problems here, right? We might, but we can, okay, what do these thresholds look like? In this case, they could be R&D budgets, right, as we'll get to. They could be kind of gross revenue from a previous year. And if you're just kind of above this line, you are and kind of obliged to abide by this regulation. Yeah. So and maybe it also goes without saying that for at least many of the other risks and kind of challenges that we've kind of outlined with the other approaches, this approach doesn't have that, right? For instance, and this is kind of encompassed in this very broad point here that you may not have read, which is very reasonable, which is that, for instance, this problem of anticipating risks as they come up, right? This problem of having thresholds that immediately change or that are quickly made obsolete, isn't so much a problem when the company itself, which is very present, we would hope, for the entirety of the training process, is there and is legally liable, etc. Right? And we can, if it's helpful to go through other examples of that, we can go through other. If it's helpful to go through other examples of that, we can go through other examples of that. We may still have concerns, though. We may still be concerned about things that we've seen companies, especially very big companies, very wealthy companies, do in the past. You may be aghast to learn that sometimes these companies engage in various kinds of accounting shenanigans. They can kind of, maybe we can imagine they try to evade thresholds. They set up this very funky legal structure such that they're not a company as defined by the law, but they can still kind of, the law of concern, but they can still kind of operate as one. And this is a concern. We do have ways of dealing with this, right? We do have other industries where we have kind of dealt with this, and not perfectly, admittedly, but we have dealt with it. And I think also, especially at the current margin, right? I think if there really are only kind of 5 or 6 companies of concern, it's relatively easy to tell when one such company is is trying to pull these kinds of shenanigans, and so it's even beyond the scope of the law. It's an easier problem to tackle. Now, and this kind of gets to, okay, yes, question. Yes, great. Maybe you'll use the mic better than I will.
Well, it's something really quickly, honestly. It's what you just say about like companies operating as companies but not being regulated as companies. Is that in the US or Canada or both? Or can you elaborate a little bit on that?
On what that would look like? On what I mean by that? Can I elaborate on what an example of that would be?
Yeah, like how they could do that. Is there like some hole or some regulatory like miss on that side?
Great.
Or?
So I think it's a great question. It's important to this is hypothetical, right? We don't have, well, as of very recently, we might have some entity-based governance, but we don't generally have a lot of entity-based AI governance. We don't have a lot of regulation focused on companies. And so are there loopholes right now? There might be, but there aren't even really kind of legal tapestries for there to be loopholes in. And so, but I think that the kind of intuition here is that we can imagine, you know, we kind of, there are kind of some pithy quotes you can imagine about how, you know, the kind of biggest companies of the world, Amazon, et cetera, paid vanishingly little tax, if any at all, because of the kind of way that they've been able to structure themselves. You know, they have this headquarter there, or, you know, I'm not the best person to describe the intricacies of what they're actually doing there and how that works. But I think there's this kind of, we can imagine this trend, especially when it comes to tax evasion, for instance. Wow, the mic every time. Maybe I'll just kind of fully commit to it. Maybe I'll kind of get rid of it entirely. We can imagine, you know, we can imagine this that companies in this case might try and pull a similar thing where they're not privy to certain considerations in some jurisdictions, et cetera, and so you get the equivalent of Amazon paying very little tax, but for AI companies. Although I can't go into the intricacies of what that would look like. Yes. Okay. Now, I think this hopefully will convey my thesis that this is very contextual, right? It's not that entity-based governance is like inherently better than use-based or model-based governance when it comes to frontier AI governance. Is that at the current margin, it probably is, right? And we can imagine a case where, especially if you have firms where most of the actors generating economic value within those firms are AIs, if almost all of them or all of them are AIs, like, you know, a lot of things go out the window, right? But we can imagine that that it might be much harder for regulators to keep up in this case. Although, again, you know, that's a whole other kind of conversation. A lot of things go out the window there. But we can also imagine that you have a decoupling of the biggest companies from the companies that pose the most that pose frontier risks, right? We can imagine that smaller companies, maybe companies that don't meet the regulatory triggers of, you know, you made this much money last year, whatever it might be, can still come to create AI systems, right? Especially if, as in the case of SB 53, one of the triggers has to do with like the last year's revenue, right? If your company starts up within 6 months and is already at the frontier, it could be posing frontier risks. You know, there could be some concerns there, you know, a bit more concrete. And we're not there yet, right? But quite plausibly we could be. And so I think, again, the case is kind of like that. At the current margin, focusing on entity-based governance for frontier risks makes a lot of sense. There may be some interesting abstract questions there about how this kind of interacts with the nature of legal precedent that I don't have interesting takes on, but if someone does, I'd be curious to hear them. Yeah, and there's also kind of a rant I could go on here about how you could make a case that this could be over-inclusive. It could regulate far too many companies. There's one of the authors of this piece wrote a critique of SB 1047 last year, and I think that it might actually apply here, but I'll save that in case, you know, as a kind of a special bonus feature if folks are interested. So yeah, we talked about this. Entity-based governance isn't necessarily inherently better, and you know, yeah. So we can imagine that like maybe we will. The problem with model-based governance is that we don't have properties that are stable at the frontier that we can use to discriminate between models that pose risk, you know, emerging risks, and those that don't. But maybe we'll find one. We don't know. Seems maybe unlikely. There's a risk of putting the cart before the horse, sure. But you know, again, the point is just that this isn't a kind of a universal statement about the nature of model-based governance. I think there's a similar case we made for use-based governance, especially if the AI systems are themselves very autonomous. They're doing a lot of things, right? So that's that. That is the gist of the take. I'd be curious to get people's views on this. Yes, there's a question. Yes. Great. Yes. Yes. Yes, we can do. Oh, so and I'll just note that, you know, the talk isn't quite over. There is a kind of parable about SB 53 and what as an example of entity-based governance. But yes, this is meant to garner questions. So please, yeah.
No, thank you for that.
Thank you.
Great sort of overview of like the different ways that this could be regulated and an argument for why entity-based regulation might be the best. Or as you also mentioned towards the end, could be under inclusive. So I appreciate that you also, like think of like where this could have drawbacks. One thing I was wondering was what we're seeing right now is the biggest companies which are building this are exempt from being regulated as public companies because they are private companies. OpenAI, Anthropic, all of them are at the moment privately held. They don't have accountability to you and me by way of quarterly statements, annual statements that need to be disclosed if they were a public company. Corporate governance, the way that it's structured, exempts them from any liabilities to anybody else but their shareholders, right? How would this work practically is one question that I have. Like, you can't compel them to release information to you about their models because there's such a competitive landscape. They just, they have incredibly strong non-compete clauses. They have information sharing sort of, guardrails for every employee as well. So how will that practically work when corporate governance is so skewed in this way, right? So that's one question that I was just mulling, and might not be a very conclusive answer to this as well, but I want your thoughts.
That's great. Thanks. No, that's a great question. I actually almost wonder if and earnestly in service of giving a good answer to this question, the thing to do here would just be to forge ahead. I think arguably, SB53 is a good example of how this kind of thing could work, and maybe we could go from here if you have questions about concerns about the effectiveness of this. So yeah, maybe it's a good example, and they have other examples in the piece. So SB53 introduces, for instance, whistleblower protections. They introduce like legal breathing room for I believe employees that have signed NDAs. Among other things, they require AI companies that are, and by the way, the trigger here is companies that are have a gross annual revenue of more than $500 million. So these companies have to conspicuously, is the word they use, which I think is funny, publish frameworks that they create themselves on their websites and comply with them. These frameworks have to address a lot of things. They have to talk about how the company is engaging, with using industry and international standards. They have to talk about catastrophic risk for those that might be interested here. How they are, what measures they are taking to address catastrophic risk, and then they have to comply with them. And if they don't comply with them, they are fined $1 million per incident, which in the scheme of things, it could be more, but they also have to report potential critical safety risks, and they kind of define all these terms to a kind of new agency in the California government. If they don't report them, right, then they get fined, right, and then their whistleblowers are kind of able to blow the whistle. And so, yes, this is some of the thinking around that, and they have to, the law would kind of, there's a process by which the law could be updated yearly. So those are the main, I think, interesting things there. I'd be curious to know what you think of that. Yeah, Leo.
You mentioned they're fined $500,000 per incident.
$1 million.
$1 million.
Yes, I believe.
Depending on how much time do they want to buy, what's to prevent them to just treat that as a cost of doing business?
Yes, it's a very good point. I think that there are, yes, that is a good example of how this law could fail. There are probably others. I think I can imagine, what regardless of what their intentions were, this could serve as like a basis for future laws. I think that indeed it might not be enough, right? But as these things often work, like they kind of like, okay, in a year's time, can we update this? Maybe we'll increase the punitive damages, because yeah, we could totally imagine them just kind of treating it as a parking ticket. Yes. But it is, but why is it significant? It's the first it's the first piece of legislation that has passed, at least in California, focused on kind of catastrophic risk, focused on, that I think people think has some non-trivial heft behind it in complying AI companies. Yes.
These regulations, if they're put in place, considering that the AI arms race is a national security issue, they're notwithstanding. That means they can be put aside or set aside for purposes of national security, which is why they're not putting in much regulation at all, and even dismantling existing regulation. How is yours going to be enforceable while this race is going on, and it won't end until they succeed with the ASI?
Is there a legal precedent that you're setting here where if something is kind of deemed a national security issue, and AI has been, then what is it? Yeah, what's the precedent?
Many times there was for example, executive order that allows for NDI, investigational new drug, can be administered for the purposes of national security for a person, even if they're unaware of it being administered. This puts aside a lot of huge amounts of protections in the name of national security. It was very controversial, but it was put into place, and it's still in place.
I see. Now, we may come to a situation where we vanishingly quickly realize or discover the outer limits of my legal expertise. But I think, I wonder if you would kind of need, I imagine there would need to be some kind of official identification of AI R&D as such. And before that happens, the companies would be liable. I would imagine that until a similar executive order is passed about how as a national security issue, or whatever kind of legal instrument is used to identify as a national security instrument, assuming that this indeed is true, happens, right? I see. So it could be. Okay, that's interesting. I don't know. I would want to look more into what the mechanics and details of that move, into the details of that move. That's great. So there are ways that this could be surmounted and kind of avoided. Definitely, that's interesting. And yeah, if you have more resources on that, that'd be good to know. Not a silver bullet, definitely, but yes. Another question somewhere. No. Yeah.
I'm just gonna give like an example of what he's talking about.
Great.
Like for example, during COVID, they had like Operation Warp Speed for vaccines. So
Yes.
something like that could definitely happen.
Right.
Like just to give an example.
Yes, this makes a lot of sense. Yeah. And my perhaps simple-minded question is whether these laws can be like breaking these laws can be retroactively pardoned, which my intuition is that they can't be. So like you would need to kind of pass something that says this is a national security issue, so then all these things go out the window. And indeed, if they identify AI as a national security issue in this way, conditional on this being a thing, I imagine these things will go out the window. Yeah.
The US was also flirting. I don't know if they actually passed it, but they were definitely flirting with the idea of preventing states from passing their own legislation related to AI. I think maybe that came off the table, but it's still in the thing.
No, yeah, that was.
It didn't
taken
go
off the
through.
table.
Okay.
It did not go through.
Awesome.
Yeah. Yes, but no. Yes, another good example of how this could be imperiled, and I think this is a kind of a technocratic topic, right? Like where it's not. There are lots of ways in which power can generally, you all know these things, kind of erode and pervert various policies. There's a question of, if we're kind of somewhat kind of looking at this in a vacuum, which are just to begin with, which are there own goals that we can avoid, for instance, by focusing on entity-based governance as opposed to model-based governance, right? Like even if we don't even have to worry about like various powerful actors coming in and undermining the authority of these laws if the laws are ineffective to begin with, which is the purpose here. But no, but these are valid concerns. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So that's the gist of the talk. If there are we could talk more about SC63, maybe why it might be a big deal, why it might not be. We can that might be best done by putting down the mics. But hopefully people are at least some people are not entirely convinced that entity-based governance is the best approach for frontier AI governance, and we should talk about that. If not, but otherwise, I'll put this down. I'll formally thank you for taking your time, spending the time here. I hope that people stay around and chat a lot. That is a central purpose of this talk. So yes, one more question. Yes, and yeah, we can do it. We can maybe close it off with a review of this here.
Yeah, I waited till the end because you'd mentioned if you were those people. Yeah,
you're not at risk at all. This is great.
One of those people.
Yeah. No. Thank you.
But yeah, so and this actually bounces off one of the questions that came from there. There is a lot of impetus for like all countries to now put forward their champions, so to speak, right? In terms of AI now. So the US executive order, which uses the words, quote unquote, cementing America's dominance in AI systems and building AI systems, and has a very militaristic and like a bent which is very much that. And JD Vance goes up to the Munich Security Conference and says you cannot regulate US companies by way of the EU AI Act, right? And it's very much a push that you cannot regulate our companies, our assets. And similarly, the EU is thinking about this. It's thinking like, oh, we're suppressing our companies from growing by way of having an EU AI Act, which is applicable to our companies, but then does not apply in equal measure to the US. So there's this very strong impetus from all countries to now put forward their sovereign champions almost, who will build AI and be their sort of horses in the game for whatever's coming next in terms of AI. So all this is to say, I'm trying to get to how you think this could potentially be impeding that narrative, how you think this would fly with regulators, with legislators, when at the same time they're all in national interest trying to champion their companies. Why would any country go ahead and regulate by entity when it would only be subjecting its own companies, which it intends to champion, to such a legislation?
Yeah.
So just theoretically, like what do you think could be their motivations?
Yeah, great. I think, and maybe there's a follow-up here, but I think that the answer here isn't specific to company-focused, entity-based governance, but I think it's simply that policymakers are not a monolith, right? I think a large part of the reason why, if not the central reason why, you had this moratorium that was mentioned, or proposed moratorium to ban state-level legislation, is because there have been many bills proposed over the last many months to try and regulate AI in various ways, because it's true, in the executive and in many other places, people are very kind of bullish and trying to, uphold and further American dominance. And there are many places, I imagine, many senators in Utah and members of legislative committees in Wisconsin that are less excited about cementing American dominance in the AI arms race, and are focused on focused on different things. So it's just there are similar things about how there are people who care about that, and there are also lots of people who care about very different things. And those people, I think, could be interested in this. As we saw here. I think in general there is a lot of interest in having AI be regulated among the public. At least somewhat, right? And but this is a kind of a generic answer. I can go on, but yeah, that's what I would say about that. But again, not specific to entity-based governance. That would just be interested in regulation in general. Yeah. Yes.
What he's talking about is the coordination problem, and if you want to look at something that's already happened and hasn't worked out too well is climate change. That's the same coordination problem. And if one country implements and the others don't, it'll be at a disadvantage. Same problem with AI. To get them all at the table to agree, that's I don't know how they're going to do that right now.
Yeah, some interesting questions there. I feel like it is indeed a very hard problem. I'm trying to think about how might this intersect with the entity-based governance stuff. I mean, and maybe it doesn't. Maybe this might be a separate discussion. But I think again it is important that that the government is not a monolith. Yes, if the kind of AI arms race narrative intensifies and the U.S. government has a so-called wake-up moment, they will maybe it'll act more like a monolith or something. But for the time being, right, you still have Scott Wiener in California, holding the AI companies to the transparency fire, if you will. Allow me to be so dramatic. And I think this kind of thing we can imagine just happening continually, insofar as you don't have this very kind of extreme and intense wake-up moment. Yeah. But once you do, that's a separate, something we can talk about afterwards. Yes. So I saw a hand. I fear that these are, I know you're all incredibly thoughtful people. I'm afraid I've kind of discouraged questions too much. So, if you have a question you think is stupid, please ask it. Because these are all excellent questions. Yeah.
I guess from a comparative standpoint, so I'm thinking about two things. I'm thinking about in Europe, they have, this risk-based kind of regulation, right? And they have, as far as I understand, they have sandboxes. And so in a way, it kind of is maybe like entity-based regulation, because the companies have to demonstrate their responsibility in sort of a restricted kind of functionality or use, in terms of like how many people they can actually, work with. And then they can kind of graduate. I think that's sort of how it's supposed to work. I'm not exactly sure. Like, would you consider that entity-based regulation, but it's just coming at it from sort of the ground up, as opposed to like after it's there, like imposing kind of a regulation on top?
And this, just to clarify, is a situation where you kind of have a trial run with
right.
a certain set of policies. Yes. I imagine it definitely could be. I think that it probably wouldn't be specific to AI, to entity-based regulation. I can imagine model-based regulation, right? That takes this form. It's kind of a funny concept of it. It's not even so much about the content of the regulation, right? It's not like, but it definitely could be a way that agent governance could, entity-based governance could work, or could manifest. But yeah, I imagine that could also happen if there were kind of use-focused proposals and model-based proposals.
Mm-hmm. I think you're right. I think they don't quite know what it is. I think they're just trying out what it is, but I feel like it could be as well.
Yeah, totally.
And then I also wanted to respond to this gentleman's question here about why, or I forget who said it, if it was you or him. Anyways, what's their motivation for adhering to these things? I feel, and I'm not an expert on China, but I do feel like I've seen a lot of very proactive legislation from China. And they, with climate, with even, social media, like, it seems like they've been quite proactive in establishing laws and guidelines and frameworks that are pretty strict. And so, my response to that is, if they're really dedicated to like really protecting people in their own country, like they'll do it. I mean, China will at least someone is. I mean, people don't like to talk about China because obviously the US is in such a war with China about it. But it does seem like China and Europe have the most sort of developed, or maybe the most dedication, or demonstrated the most dedication towards actually imposing regulations, which is interesting considering, China's the US's biggest sort of competitor. So
Yeah, totally. No, this is very interesting. There's a lot there. It's also useful information. There are many AI arms race focused talks that I could give in the future. If people are interested in that. So, keep that in mind. Yeah, I would love to hear this gentleman's response. Maybe this is a kind of good point though, where I would do so as a fly on the wall, and we can break out into non-mic'd discussions and mingle freely. But Joey, I'll just say thank you for the questions. Excellent questions. Thank you for coming. Thank you for listening. I would love to chat with you afterwards. I hope you enjoyed the pizza. That's all. Thanks.